Do you think the world is going to be recognizable 10 years from now in 2035?
I mean, in the sense that like the continents will exist, yes. But in terms of the superstructure, like societal layer above it, I think very few institutions that created the internet will survive the internet. And I look at it as this, it's in a sense, the single most important force in the world, yet still underestimated. It's like, it's upstream of AI, it's upstream of crypto, in a real sense, it's upstream of China, upstream of robotics, upstream of what we're doing right now. It's in front of your face when you wake up, and it's on your watch when you go to sleep. And it's in front of politics. You know, Twitter elected Trump, and Twitter deplatformed Trump, and then X re-elected Trump. And that happened in every other country. Twitter caused Brexit, and Twitter, caused every political fracas we've seen. And that's just like one rivulet of the internet. And so yeah, I think the world is going to be radically, radically different. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, you guys, you guys are maybe a little bit older than me, but I think kind of the world was relatively static from 1980 to 2015 or so, and then it really started changing quite rapidly over the last 10 years. I don't know if you guys feel the same way.
Well, I had Ray Kurzweil on our stage at the Abundance Summit, and he said we're going to see as much change between now and 2035 as we saw between 1925 and 2025, a century's worth of progress.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And so while continents are going to be the same, and probably our biology may be the same, society's structures, when you say those will all disappear, you mean political systems, financial systems, what systems?
Yeah. So my view on the world is internet first. And so I think that essentially, I'm going to give a very quick macro structure and then go from there. Right now, the two kind of growing powers in the world, in my view, are China and the internet. China is everything physical. The internet's everything digital. The internet has disrupted blue America and taken over media and money. China's disrupted red America, taken over manufacturing and the military. So Chinese robots, Chinese drones, that's on the physical side. And then AI on media and crypto on money, that's on the digital side. And these two kind of forces are just growing stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And a lot of the 2010s was about trying to resist them with the trade war and the tech clash, respectively. But the resistance was actually overcome, and China and the internet are actually winning. And so I think the future is China and the internet. And again, actually, that is communism versus capitalism. Much as, for example, in the early 1900s, Europe was the center of the world. And then it just sort of buckled in, and it was American capitalism versus Soviet communism, splitting Europe down the center with the West Germans on the capitalist side, East Germans on the communist side. I think America was the center of the world in the early 2000s, and it's sort of involuting, and you'll have the Chinese on one side, and you'll have the internet on the other side, like a lot of Chinese communist-backed factions and Bitcoin maximalist factions. And you'll have lots of different startup societies around the world. One of the reasons for this is that, since you asked, my view on this, people talk about what money is, and people talk about it as a unit of account, a medium of exchange, a store of value. But Andreesen Horowitz had a good line with the fourth purpose of money, which is a system of control. And so that's to say, you can freeze accounts, you can seize accounts, you can direct printed money, you can, give banking licenses or not. That's actually, and in some ways, an even more powerful tool than the police system, because, the police aren't as scalable as the monetary system. The monetary system is everywhere, and it directs people silently, and there's not really a vote over who gets a banking license or not, or what have you. That entire system, the Fed's control over that system, which is the US dollar, but also the Canadian dollar, the Japanese yen, the British pound, the German mark, and so on. If you look at the yields for all Western currencies, they're rising like this. And the yield for China is going down like this because all kinds of money is going into China. And conversely, Bitcoin is also appreciating. So all the capital is going into RMB and BTC. And so that means that it's not just like the US dollar, but the Canadian dollar, the British pound, all the things that are in the US greater sphere, what you call it, the American empire or the West or the international community, that what Putin calls the golden billion, people have different names for it. All of that kind of crashes at the same time in real terms. And so that means control is lost over a very large swath of formerly wealthy territory. And stability is...
Hold on, two clarifying questions very quickly. One is, when you say internet, I'd love for you to kind of describe what do you see as the internet, because that's very amorphous. And secondly,
yes,
when you say internet and China, would you also equate centralization and decentralization in that equation?
Roughly, yes. Correct. So China is roughly, so when I say China and the internet, that is a shorthand for China is like, it's China itself, but it's also the physical world. It's the past. It's the land. It's gold, right? It's bricks, both in the sense of gold bricks and BRICS. It is minerals, it's mining, it's roads, it's the giant cities and so on coming out of the ground, right? And what is the internet? The internet is the virtual, right? In a sense, actually, China's the 19th century, right? So it's the past, or you could also say it's like 1950s America, like the girders and stuff coming out of the ground. The internet is the virtual, and really, when I say the internet, I mean the free internet, the Anglospheric internet, the unregulated internet, and that is it's obviously cryptocurrency, it's AI. And of course, you can say once you define these poles, there's obviously a Chinese internet. There is, in many ways, that's like the front lines, right? The front lines are, where do the Chinese tech founders go? Like, are Jack Ma's purged by China? Or do they go abroad and start startup cities, a Chinese capitalist party to compete with the Chinese Communist Party? I think we'll see some of, or do they integrate with the Chinese regime? I think that's a very important sort of thing, sort of how like, Germany was a border zone for communism versus capitalism. That's one very important border zone. Another border zone is India, where there's like the physical India, which is in BRICS, and there's internet India and the Indian diaspora, right? And in this way, you can identify border zones between the kind of physical and digital all over the world. And I think that if you apply that lens to many things, it's also state versus network, right? So it's land versus cloud, it's state versus network, it's physical versus digital, it's past versus future, it's gold versus digital gold. But what's going away is basically the quote rules-based order, the post-war order, right? There's another very important graph. If you Google
and Balaji,
GDP,
I'm going to
stop me and jump
I'm
in.
going to slow this down because I'm sure our listeners are spinning as well as I am. I'm probably going to come back and listen to this at 0.8 speed just to hear it one more time. Dave, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, well, look, the whole time that I was growing up, Japan was going to take over the world. The Japanese economy was skyrocketing. It was about to catch up to the U.S. It was going to bypass us in per capita GDP any day. And my brother actually went to Japan to learn Japanese because of the imminent takeover. And then it all stopped cold, largely because of an aging demographic that no one had factored into their math. And so now, China's per capita GDP is way behind the U.S. still, but the total GDP, country GDP, is catching up fast. But if you look at the underlying aging demographic, it's even worse than Japan, actually by far. It's the worst in world history, and the reason the U.S. Has stayed strong for so long is largely immigration. We have incredibly talented people from all over the world, including China, coming into the country and creating new companies, creating new ideas. And China has none of that. They have virtually no immigration. So curious to get your take on how that's going to play out. If you view the world, the 10-year future of the world as internet and China, but is China going to grind to a halt like Japan did?
Totally. So let me actually take all your points in reverse order. First of all, I'm very sympathetic to your kind of worldview. I like that America. That's America that we both grew up in and spent a lot of time in. So I'm only saying these things from an analytical lens, not this should be the thing, but this is the thing. Okay. So first, in reverse order, China's just actually introduced a so-called K visa, which actually they are using to recruit global tech talent. So taking your points in reverse order, the U.S. is cutting off H-1B, is cutting off researcher visas, cutting off student visas, cutting off even tourist visas. Europeans, Australians are reporting getting strip search. Tourism has crashed the U.S. The nationalist faction is cutting off visas. And unfortunately, a lot of socialists are also very much against tech, and they're not really going to be that enthusiastic about more tech guys coming in. Regarding Japan, the reason that they lost in the 80s was actually because of something called the Plaza Accords. At that time, remember, the U.S. still occupies Japan. It has the U.S. military in Japan. It nuked Japan and wrote its constitution and so on and so forth. And so the Plaza Accords, among other things, stopped Japan from actually using the JPY to go and buy U.S. property and so on, and forced them to instead buy worthless treasuries and the money printing stuff and so on that began the Japanese Great Stagnation. One way of putting in contrast the big difference between Japan and China is genuinely sovereign. What does that mean? For example, in 2017, the New York Times reported that in 2010, the Chinese had actually gone and killed many American spies in China. They had rolled up a bunch of rings there. Now, of course, spy versus spy happens. China obviously spies on America, and there's all kinds of this thing going back and forth. But the reason that's an important contrast, Japan could never kill American spies. Right? Because it can never do that, it can never have communications or operations that were not seen by America. It was not truly sovereign. America had root control over Japan in a way it doesn't over China. In fact, that's the common thread of kind of Chinese policy over the last 50 years. You know how like certain founders like Zuck, for example, he may have sold some of his company, but he never gave up control, right? He always wanted to maintain voting rights, even if he gave up some financial rights. In the same way, at many times, if you study the last 50 years, China has taken worse financial terms to retain control, right? They have always pushed for sovereignty. That's something where their culture is the century of humiliation, and they were crushed for many years. So they can never give up sovereignty. They'll never do that again, no matter how much it is. Very similar to a founder who's very motivated to keep control of their company. So as a consequence, China is sovereign, and it has surveillance-proof deliberations in a way that Japan doesn't. And as one concrete example of that, last year, the year before, when Gina Raimondo, who was the then Commerce Secretary, went to China, they launched this Huawei phone on the day that she arrived that had chips that showed that China had at least partially gotten out from underneath the chip ban. And that kind of thing could never be done by Japan because Japan couldn't do anything in stealth, right? China can do things in stealth, Japan can't. Finally, I would say within tech, we often see something that kind of half works and it's a bubble, and then people discount it. And then it comes back 5 or 10 or 15 years later, then it really works. Example, Webvan didn't work, but then DoorDash did. Example, the Palm Pilot kind of worked, and then the iPhone did, right? Example, World of Warcraft kind of worked, and then Fortnite really did. And so if you think of China as like the real version of that, where it's actually working, then that's another thing where past performance may not guarantee future results. Let me pause there.
Can I ask you about timelines on this too? Because a lot of the trend lines are 10-year trend lines, and Peter's question was a 10-year question. But AI is like a 2 or 3 year thing. And so if I use the analogy of World War II, Pearl Harbor Day was December 1941. The war was effectively over in 1944, truly over in 1945. So start to finish for the US, it was only a 3 or 4 year journey. I think AI is on that same kind of trajectory where the declaration of war was essentially the chip ban against China. So we're about a year into it now. And the timeline from here to a resolution, I think, is going to be similar, very, very short because of the exponential rate of change. So, when we look at demographic trends, long-term demographic trends, that's always going to be 10, 15, 20 years to resolve. But I think the actual action is in a much, much shorter timeline. Do you agree?
Okay, so let me give, I've got 4 more counter arguments there.
And then I'm going to move us to the paper that started this conversation.
Of course.
I really want to hit on that pretty hard.
Of course, so I'll be brief.
Yeah.
I have 25 questions, but I'll wait.
Okay, great.
Me too.
So first is, China's demographic problems have robotic solutions. And the thing is that why did the South lose the Civil War? Because the North industrialized. The North didn't have slave labor. And many times, if you look, societies that have lots of, for example, illegal aliens aren't slaves, but they're often paid, under table wages and so on and so forth. They're exploited in different ways. If you have a society that's got an abundance of, quote, cheap labor, it often fails to industrialize, fails to automate. And China is using its kind of demographic pressure to automate as like a 1% shock every year to force them to automate. If you've ever been to China, like it's already ahead on that kind of thing. They already have the delivery drones, they have the hotel robots, they have all of that kind of stuff. So that's kind of point number 1. Point number 2 is, if you actually look at other metrics besides dollars, one of the issues is dollars are controlled by the US government. And so you have to actually look at physical production. China, for example, has one shipyard, as the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, Carlos Del Toro, said, produces more ships than the entire U.S. Navy combined. Hegseth, who's current Secretary of Defense, has said Chinese hypersonics can sink all U.S. aircraft carriers. The Raytheon CEO has said that the U.S. can't decouple from China. And there's a Govini study that was commissioned by the Pentagon, $400 million study, that basically showed the U.S. military is made in China. If you go and look at the Tomahawk or the JDAM, the famous American weapons, their supplier are all Chinese factories. So the war is actually already over. It's actually already been lost because China can just hit a button and just shut off supply chain, right? That's why what's going on with the rare earth elements and so on and so forth. This is something that in a sense, the war was fought with the trade war in 2015, and the U.S. lost because what China did is it diversified its revenue streams outside of the West. Only 15% of its revenue comes from the U.S., 85% comes from non-U.S. sources. So even if the tariffs chopped it in half, they still got 95% of their revenue left. And so I think that even the chip ban, for example, challenging the Chinese to a test of quantum mechanics and like semiconductor production when all 4 the major chip companies, look, can the Chinese as a culture, can they do chip making? Of course, it's like challenging the Italians to a pizza making contest. And so, this was right in their wheelhouse, like do math and computer science and manufacturing for national pride and Chinese sovereignty, right? It would be much better to challenge them on, for example, arguing in English. That's not their strong point, like making international media. Their only success on media. Go ahead.
No, that's funny. That's funny.
It's funny, right?
Balaji,
So like,
I'm gonna because I want to really hit where our audience wants to hear about.
Of course.
I want to dive
AI.
into to AI and crypto in particular here. So
one thing I will say, I'll just say one last thing is I do believe the internet can balance China, but MAGA is trying to be more China than China. We have to be more America than America. That's what the internet represents. It represents free speech. It represents free markets. It represents decentralization. It represents things that China can't clone internally without breaking its whole system apart, right? So I think that a lot of what MAGA is doing is like China envy, trying to out-manufacture China, even having mimetic rivalry over Taiwan, but we can play our own game, which is the internet. So I'm hopeful, but I think the hope is on a different axis than people think. Let me pause
I have a quick question before you switch topics, Peter. Balaji, I've heard you talk about China, internet, Democrats, Republicans, right?
Yes.
I'm assuming in that overall equation, Europe is irrelevant, India is mostly irrelevant, Brazil is irrelevant? Much more minor?
I think Eastern Europe, so let me be more granular. I'm actually fairly bullish on Eastern Europe. I'm extremely bearish on Western Europe. I think it'll be the opposite of the 20th century, roughly. Every country that did poorly in the 20th century, because they suffered through communism, socialism, they now are capitalist and or, rationally nationalist. Conversely, every country that was wealthy in the 20th century, they became degenerate and they started fighting amongst themselves. So I actually think Latin America, like El Salvador, especially, and maybe Argentina, is actually on the ups because they've sort of gotten immunized against a century of, drugs and so on. I'm not saying everywhere it gets there, but I think Bukele could be like, who's the guy who unified 4 states? His name's Simón Bolívar. Bukele is young in his career. He could be the Simón Bolívar of Latin America. I think he's like Bukele Lee Kuan Yew. I'm actually very bullish on him. I'm actually very bullish on Indians and moderately bullish on India. On many metrics, if you look at like nuclear, if you look at steel, China's far and away number 1, but India is a real but distant number 2. It has come up a lot, and it's radically different than from my youth. My youth, it really was like, like a third world country. It's really not that anymore in big pieces of it, right? So I'm moderately bullish on India, extremely bullish on Indians. I'm bullish on the Middle East in the form of Dubai and Riyadh. I'm bullish on Eastern Europe. It's basically just an involution, almost a flip of the 20th century.